Thought Crimes.
Welcome to Thought Crimes, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with Whitney Houston. This is your boy, Prince Solomon.
And this is your girl, Sincere. So just like Prince said, we're going to get started on how the industry destroyed Whitney Houston.
All right, then. So, how do you feel about Ms. Whitney Houston, Sincere?
Whitney Houston as an artist, of course, she was prolific. She had the golden voice. She had the voice. And she was just an amazing artist with a strong vocals. I mean, and you felt it through the music. You know, when she also performed the national anthem. For me personally, is the best rendition ever done. And you know, Whitney Houston was basically, I listened to her music routinely when I was a kid. You know, my aunts, my mom, everybody in the family. She was definitely, you know, circulated in the house along with Prince and Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson and TLC and, you know, different R&B artists, soul music and Donny Hathaway. So, you know, she definitely left an impression on pop culture, American culture, but also around the world, global. She was a global powerhouse. And, you know, she grew up, of course, in the church, singing gospel. A lot of the best singers when it comes to music history, you know, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, they all started in the church, the black church. And Whitney was no different. But the only difference is, of course, she definitely lost her way, as did a lot of them. Some of them did with drug use, although she definitely was put under the influence, I believe you told me, by her brother. Is that correct, Prince?
Well, you know, yeah, that's what he stated to the public, that is, after her death, you know, and they were sitting down with Whitney Houston's family, and he actually said he was the one that introduced her to drugs, narcotics. Miss Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born August 9th, 1963. She died February 11th of 2012. And what's interesting, February 11th is actually Brandy's birthday, who Whitney Houston took up under her arm as far as mentorship as well. And of course, you know, we all know that what was stated is that she died by drowning due to drug intoxication, that is. And Whitney Houston was one of the premier powerhouses of the 90s, that is. And of course, there was like this somewhat of a trifecta. You had Prince, Whitney Houston. No, it wasn't a trifecta. It was Prince, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey. I mean, you had a lot of these big powerhouses of the 90s. And one thing about it, though, except for Prince and Michael, but at least on one time they were actually on stage together. But, you know, all of these people tend to work together. And what's interesting is that, about the 2000s, about 2015, 14, 13, and 16, I mean, you just saw them disappear. That is, I think the last one that's really remaining is Mariah Carey out of the group.
Mariah Carey out of that whole class is Mariah Carey and Madonna, but
we don't really count Madonna.
Yeah, she be on some other shit.
Yes,
but but Mariah Carey is the last one. Going into it, you know, her music, you know, 1992 was definitely a golden year for Whitney. You know, also coming out with The Bodyguard, being nominated, a married R&B star, Bobby Brown, you know, was definitely a big thing. And even though you had drug rumors in 1992 pertaining to Whitney, it wasn't something that overclouded her music. And it wasn't something that people believed, because she had such a polished image that people wouldn't think that she would be doing drugs. But a lot of people that at that time who had very polished images were doing cocaine.
Prince was, he dabbled in some drugs as well at that time too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that has nothing to do, we were going to make it clear here, Prince and I always said that has nothing to do with his death that took place recently. But at that particular time, he was dabbling in some drug use as well. Also, you know, going back to Whitney, like we said before, it it was a huge thing to keep these artists hooked on drugs. Even before this, you could go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s. It was a huge thing to keep these artists on drugs because it allowed the execs to keep the rights to the music and to make sure they maintain the power over the artist. That's why, I mean, it's rare to even name an artist that didn't do drugs at one time or wasn't influenced by drugs, whether we're talking about David Bowie, any of them, because again, it was an incentive there to have them on drugs because it was easier to manipulate them, easier to control them, easier to have rights to their music. And Whitney Houston was no different.
Smokey Robinson spoke about that. He said this is why he kind of kept himself clean throughout the industry. He said, I needed to be aware and exactly being able to pay attention to what was taking place in my surroundings, man. And Whitney Houston, you know, she released her first album in 1985, Whitney Houston, and then 1987, Whitney, and then 1990, I'm Your Baby Tonight, a.k.a. the X-Men had hijacked that song for their theme song for the opening cartoon at that time. I'm just messing around. But My Love Is Your Love in 98, Just Whitney in 2002, One Wish, the Holiday album in 2003, and I Look to You in 2009. And of course, she continued on. Now, going back to what you were stating about the drug usage, of course, this is some stuff that had taken place within her inner circles, you know, dealing with her family and then her peers. But of course, when we're talking about business, I mean, it actually goes into the whole slave thing. You know, you want to keep an artist, or at least create the atmosphere for them to continue drug usage. Even now today, when we listen to a lot of these rappers that are constantly talking about lean and other drugs and, you know, narcotics and things of that nature. I mean, again, it would be in the corporate label's best interest to keep a slave completely aloof and unaware, and actually always in a state of constant escapism. That way you can manipulate them to however you want. So this is one of the, you know, reasons why people should, if they are in the industry or just in general, I mean, you should follow the Smokey Robinson model. The man kept himself clean for the most part, been able to conduct his business successfully, because of course what happens is that, you know, you burn out a lot quicker. And Whitney Houston actually, just by the strength of her voice and her discography, she should have been able to continue on a lot longer than she did.
Much longer, you know. Yeah, absolutely. And going back to what you were saying there, Lil Wayne is the reason why Baby was fond of Lil Wayne being drugged up. Now, finally, when he comes out of his drug-induced haze, he's like, where's the money? Ray Charles, same thing that happened. David Bowie lost a lot of money. It wasn't until he stopped doing drugs that he was able to get his catalog back on online, basically, and have ownership. Because if he continued through that drug path, drug haze, he actually would have been broke and destitute, which is what happens to a lot of artists who aren't basically managing. Now, there are some rare cases where you do have artists who didn't do drugs and still, got screwed over, because they suffered through poverty. And they thought these 360 deals was basically going to help them and alleviate that, because, you get a lot of money up front. But then they find out, through what they signed, that they were actually getting the raw deal. So you do have those as well. But a lot of people, it was a incentive for a lot of artists to be on drugs. And like Prince said, when we're talking about the drug culture now, people always be like, the drug culture has gotten out of control. The drug culture has always been out of control, and the drug culture has already been here. And you can even go back to a lot of the greatest jazz musicians and some of the singers who were on drugs, and who, again, the exec wanted that, and Whitney is no different. Whitney Houston definitely is someone who had staying power. And the sad thing is when you see such talent destroyed, and we said how the industry destroyed Whitney Houston, because the industry has the ability to destroy a lot of people. You know, we even if we go into DMX, his story, being molested as a child, how he got into drugs, it's something that it isn't really talked about in a way of sympathy and empathy for some of these artists, because there's they have so much money. People perceive them to having so much money, but people don't understand the workings behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I still see bias when it comes to black artists. I will say that, because they don't talk about black artists when they have suffered drug usage.
Yeah, like Billie Holiday.
Yeah, in a humanizing manner. Mm-hmm. Billie Holiday was another one. In fact, they compared Whitney Houston in many ways to Billie Holiday. Well, at the time, she was like a contemporary Billie Holiday, completely a talented individual, but a story of tragedy as well. Then also, though, George Michael had suffered the same fate as well recently, which the media, I kind of noticed they kind of slid it, a little bit around. But usually if it's a black artist, it's plastered all over the news as, this had consumed their entire career and they were animals for the most part. But I saw something that was similar to Michael Jackson's death. And again, this is the American culture's addiction to necrophilia, especially pertaining to black life. Because when Michael Jackson was alive, I mean, culturally, he was the butt of every joke, which was interesting because Chris Tucker actually said Michael really didn't mind. He didn't care. They said he was actually pretty funny about a lot of things. The only thing he didn't like was the whole thing regarding the child pedophile jokes and things like that. He wasn't fond of that at all. But when he died, though, overnight, everybody treated him like he was Jesus. I remember seeing MSNBC, NBC, CBS, ABC News coverage. Like, it was so disgusting. I turned off the television for that entire week. And then also, I was going to say here, with Whitney Houston, it was the same thing. She was kind of like she was a joke for a minute, a cultural joke, and everybody had, got their punch in. And then, when she died, it was like all of a sudden overnight. And I do know that for the most part, how people say, well, folks just realize the value of somebody when they're gone. But again, the media didn't go out of its way to try to humanize Whitney Houston's struggle the way they did, like, say, other artists, that is.
Well, the incentive isn't there. You demonize them, so once they're dead, you can flip it and have people have some type of sympathy or empathy for them, so their music can still sell. You can't have a catalog that isn't worth selling anymore if you're still demonizing somebody. So you have to, take away your fangs, and now it's time to heal, and now it's time to make people remember the feeling they had when these artists first came out, before they knew about anything they were dealing with internally. And that's what they do. That was what the media does. So that's why once Whitney is dead, once Michael is dead, they have to change the narrative so people can still want to listen to their music and still feel the same way they did when they first listened to it. Now, Prince is a little bit different because, they needed to put a little bit salt on his death and before they crescent him, which they will do eventually again. But they had to put a little salt there because now they have to create a doubt. And they need that doubt in order for the vultures to move out on his catalog, which they already have. So, it's all a chess game. And going back to Whitney here, like, come on, like, these people, the greatest musicians to me, and I'm not being biased, a lot of them are black, but, you look at, how they've touched hands, Whitney, Michael, Prince, Janet, how they've even worked behind the scenes together. Although we talked about this in the Janet Jackson video, we kind of wish that they would have formed up like Voltron to do stuff together pertaining to the music industry, and a lot of them didn't start doing it until it was too late. But again, that's what happens when you have drugs involved. That's what happens when you have music execs trying to keep them separated, because they would be, look, the music execs were not the people that are important. When you look at Whitney, who grew up in the church, she could have still done great music without having them. If you look at Michael Jackson, if you look at Prince, who was a musical genius, he didn't need them. So, they were basically pimps, kind of.
Yeah, that was it. And it is something that they were able to do successfully. And of course, what's going to happen afterwards is what's going to determine whether what they're going to do with the catalog, of course. And I mean, we saw what they did with Tupac, and there were people that were close to Tupac when they saw the supposed 3D, hologram at the Coachellas, which it wasn't really a hologram. It's an old animation technique that, they've been using since the days of Disney. But there were people close to Tupac, they said they felt it was disgusting. It was like, we're going to still pimp you in death. And that is something they actually said they wanted to do, the whole hologram thing with Tupac. They want to do it with Prince. They want to do it with Michael Jackson. They want to do it with Whitney Houston. And what's ironic, even when they did it with Michael Jackson, you notice what was the first song they had him dancing to, his hologram image. It was called Slave to the Rhythm. It was like a sadistic fuck you, basically, to Michael Jackson and, his estate. And the thing is, with black artists, even going back to the days of Sam Cooke, black artists have always been under scrutiny. They've always had an air of possibility of death if they tried to fight for their ownership. It was suspected the same thing that happened to Jimi Hendrix. Of course, the story goes that Jimi Hendrix died, from inhaling his own vomit. But they actually had people within his camp that came forward not too long ago and said, no, we did kill Jimi Hendrix. And it was a story that floated right up under the radar. So same thing with Whitney Houston. The death was very mysterious. There were neighbors that said they heard thumping. This whole thing about Clive Davis making sure that the body stayed, in the room for about 13 to 14 hours. He didn't want anybody to, quote unquote, disturb the Grammy Awards as well. So you had a lot of weird things floating around Whitney Houston's death, but that's usually the case with a lot of black artists.
And Whitney Houston image is easy to use too. It's $1 billion image there, more than $1 billion image. You can have a theme park, you can have hologram of her singing, and you can have also do remixes. Definitely a lot of her songs will lend to remixes with house music or the new type of house music and techno and stuff that is being used right now. And I mean, look, they can use these people's image forever. Yep, and keep it going over and over and over again, and that's what they will do. Like what they've set up already with Prince. But to go back to Whitney here, how do you feel about what's being talked about with Ray J saying he feels guilty, also Clive Davis? How do you feel about Clive Davis' relationship with Whitney Houston and some of the other people that are kind of nefarious that were so-called behind her career?
What do you think about Whitney Houston and Ray J's death, though? Not Ray J's death, but what do you think about Ray J saying he was responsible for Whitney Houston's death? Do you think he's making himself bigger than what he really was in the picture, or you think he's actually feeling some guilt for contributing to, helping her buy drugs and things like that?
I think if you help somebody buy drugs, you are somewhat at fault, but I don't know the extent of their relationship and what took place behind the scenes to really say much on that.
Yeah. And I what was interesting, I will say, going back to the points we said earlier about how these particularly black musicians are treated as, in a sense, cannon fodder and slaves. Like the night Whitney died, right? And then I think it was kind of like the same day, or it may have been the same night actually. Clive Davis, and don't get me wrong, I have nothing against Jennifer Hudson, right? I think she's a talented individual. But Clive Davis was on CNN, right? And he was having a discussion. I don't know who it was at the time. I can't remember. But you all can YouTube the video. And he was saying basically for the most part, that Jennifer Hudson is the new Whitney Houston. You see what I'm saying? So it was like, he wasn't giving the audience any time to breathe. He wasn't giving people any time to at least catch themselves, because Whitney Houston was still a big name. So for her to die, it was just one of those situations where people were just like shocked. But Clive Davis, being the businessman that he has always been, he's like, oh no, I understand what you guys are saying about her death, but this is the new Whitney Houston. But you got any final thoughts on this?
Well, going back into the whole Jennifer Hudson aspect of it, of course you have people that are always propped up as replacements, like Britney Spears was pertaining to Janet Jackson. But and Jennifer Hudson definitely has a great voice. One could say, yeah, it could be one of those voices that will be up there with Mariah and Whitney. But and who's to say that she has nefarious means behind it? More than likely, she doesn't.
No.
But again, all these artists are usually used as pawns to be played in the chess game of money. The music industry was created, and we're talking about the organization of it, the structure with the studios, were created by gangsters and mobsters and people who were killed for their money, and that hasn't changed. So that correlates into what happened to Whitney. Also, the assassination of her character and the lack of empathy and sympathy, on top of being sanctified after her death so they can make that money.
And there's a key thing you illustrate there. They always Christian them after their death, So it's the same thing. We saw how disgusting they were with the treatment of Michael Jackson's image. We saw what they did with Prince. They actually did the opposite of Prince, right? Because with Whitney and Michael, they were demonized basically for the most part of their duration of their career. And then in death, like you state, they were sanctified. Prince, for the most part, kept a squeaky clean image, or at least he cleaned himself up image-wise from the 70s and mid 80s, and he was able to maintain himself, at least a low-key persona under the radar. Then immediately when he died, they began demonizing his image. So there was like, oh, we got to dirty it up a little bit. But folks, this is us discussing Whitney Houston, what had taken place, how the industry did go in on her, and what took place at the inception of her career with drug usage within her family, and how it followed her throughout her career. And of course, we didn't get into the Bobby Brown aspect, but we felt that Bush has been beat so many times. But folks, leave your comments below. Tell us, what do you think about how Whitney's career had been handled? What do you think about her suspicious death? Even that of her daughter. Yeah, I was just getting ready to get into that. Her daughter Bobby as well. Christina. And the fact that they said they will move forward with using more and more of her music and image and likeness to, of course, sell more products.
Also, you can subscribe to Dark Crimes. Don't forget to donate to our PayPal and Patreon. You can also check out our email, darkcrimes1984@gmail.com. Again, darkcrimes1984@gmail.com.
All right, now this is your boy Prince Solomon.
Insincere.
Peace.
I saw the check, nigga. Huh?
Basta!